Hi everyone, Dr. Oliver here with a discussion on family. First, we will discuss parent-child conflict and then move on to sibling conflict. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to define and explain attachment theory, distinguish the differences between person-centered and position-centered parenting approaches, discuss the various levels of influence on families as a system, and be able to identify the various ways sibling communication or conflict can influence the individual development or personalities of those siblings. First, we cannot discuss parent-child communication or conflict without talking about attachment theory. Now, attachment theory has been altered many times in the past, but was originally created by Bowlby and then those that came after him, such as his student Ainsworth, who later on altered the theory a bit to include more distinctions on what is relevant and important to this theory. Now, attachment theory argues that the first few years of our life are very important in developing not only how we view ourselves, but how we develop relationships and socialize with others later on. The argument was made that how we trust and communicate with a caregiver in our early days can then be illustrative of how we trust and communicate with others later on. So the original theory said that there are 4 attachment styles that could explain the ways in which people were raised and how that raising affects our view of self and our views of others. So these 4 styles are dependent on how they inform our views of ourself and our thoughts of others, particularly the other being a romantic interest or relationship that we will engage with later on in life. So, secure attachment styles tend to have a high view of self and a high view of others, or a positive view of self and positive view of others. This is likely because they were raised in a way where their parents communicated love and affection for them. Parents showed them attention in a caring and giving way. They probably used direct definitions such as, "You are very important," "We are proud of you." And this likely led them not only to have a positive self-esteem within themselves, but also to them seeing themselves in a positive light, and also for their ability to trust others and see others in a positive light. So those in a secure attachment style likely have higher social skills than those that don't. On the opposite side of the spectrum are those in a fearful attachment style. This would be where someone was raised in a neglectful way, or maybe their parent was abusive or even completely absent. So if you were not communicated towards in a positive, loving, affectionate way early on, but were instead told you were a mistake or that you would never amount to anything, that is proven to have and to cultivate a low self-esteem in yourself, and you also may not be as trustworthy of others due to this. So later on in life, when it comes to entering into romantic relationships, you may be more fearful of engaging in a relationship and trusting others because of what was communicated to you by a parent or caregiver at an early age. Now, the third, anxious ambivalent, is an attachment style that says that we are anxious because we are experiencing some kind of inconsistency in early parenting. So either our parent is there at times and then absent, or we know sometimes we can trust our parent and then other times we can't. Some anxious ambivalent attachment styles have been seen with parents who are incarcerated. So sometimes they are there, sometimes they are not. Or even parents that struggle with substance abuse. Sometimes these parents are loving, caring, and affectionate when they're sober, but other times they're abusive or damaging when they are using. So this inconsistency causes the child anxiety. It causes them to think that this is their fault and that others likely don't have to experience this inconsistency. But this is something that is based off of ourselves, and others don't have to experience this inconsistent parenting, is what makes this a unique style. If you are an anxious ambivalent attachment, you likely have low self-esteem because you were raised in an inconsistent way causing anxiety, but you may have high thoughts of others or trust in others because you assume that they had a more stable way of being raised. The last style is called the dismissive attachment style. The dismissive attachment style are people who dismiss the neglectful or maybe inconsistent ways in which they were raised. So they might have had that parent that was sometimes affectionate and other times abusive, or that parent that sometimes they could depend on but other times couldn't. But this inconsistency causes them to argue that it is not them that's causing the inconsistency, but that it's the fault of the parents. They are going to dismiss that way of being raised, and therefore they have a higher self-esteem. So they're not saying it's my fault, and I am not using my anxiety to argue that this is inconsistent because of me, but they're saying I have a high sense of esteem because it is an external cause. It's my parents' fault. I'm going to dismiss that upbringing. Now, this still leads those to have a lack of trust with others because you may have lower sociability or thoughts about others because you fear that they could be like your parents and be inconsistent. Now, this is a very generic explanation of this topic and this complicated theory, and there's much more information out there on this topic. But what attachment says is that the ways in which we were raised, particularly the ways in which we were parented early on, can affect us and how we engage in relationships throughout our lives. When it comes to parent-child communication, we know much like other forms of communication, it often involves power. Think back to our third module when we talked about power and how power changes based on context. So too does power within our parent-child relationships. For example, when you are young or when you are even a toddler, parents may communicate in conflict with you using bargaining. I will give you this cookie if you promise to eat all your vegetables. That is what helps goal fulfillment when we are that age. But eventually, that might turn into a demand-withdrawal pattern. The idea that I learned that my parent has more power and therefore will get their way, so they might consistently be the demander and us the withdrawer. And we know later in life this can also change. Another example of how parent-child communication evolves is that we might start out early on in life having very explicit rules communicated to us by our parents, such as do not do this, make sure you avoid this, make sure you always say sir, make sure you always say please and thank you. But later on, the communication might be more implicit. For example, they may assume that we would keep in touch with our siblings later on in life, and they would assume that they wouldn't have to tell us verbally to do so. So we can fall into lulls of explicit and then implicit rules as we age and as the power changes in our parent-child relationship. We also know that the conflict topics are likely to change as a parent-child relationship evolves over time. So usually conflict topics, especially in our early childhood and adolescence, are surrounded by this notion of seeking and establishing independence. So we experience conflict because we want to be able to spend our own time doing what we really want to do. So we don't want to come home at curfew. We want to be in control of what sport we play or how we want to spend our free time. And so trying to seek independence from our parents oftentimes causes conflict in that parent-child relationship. We might also want to determine what beliefs and values we want to converge and diverge with our parents. Especially in adolescence and within college years and early adulthood, we're trying to figure out what we believe in and what we value as an individual. Oftentimes, we do this by confirming or comparing our beliefs and values to those we were raised by. When it comes to our parents' beliefs and values, we either converge or we diverge from those beliefs. Another thing that changes as we communicate with our parents over the life course is simply how open or closed we are on particular topics. There might be a time in our lives where we are extremely closed with our parents, such as adolescence or the college years. Maybe you don't want to tell your parents everything about who you're dating. Maybe you don't want to tell them what you do for fun or how you spend your weekends. Maybe that's considered to be taboo or taboo topics that you wouldn't bring up with your parents at this particular time. However, later on in life, when you become a parent yourself, when you mature, you might have more in common with your parent. These taboo topics may no longer be considered as taboo. So maybe you can be more open in this area with your parents now that you've matured and that you have these so-called similarities. So parent-child communication, of course, changes over time. Now, there's considerable research on parenting approaches and how communication from a parent can affect how that child fares. So parent-child communication plays a key role in a child's socialization skills. Much like we talked about in attachment theory, Burleson and other scholars argue that parents use one of two parenting strategies when it comes to how they try and regulate their child's behavior. These two strategies are considered person-centered and position-centered approaches to parenting. Person-centered approaches include regulating and confirmation messages that emphasize how persons are affected by the behavior of others. So if I want to raise my child to be empathetic, to make sure that they think about another person before they act, because I want them to become an empathetic person themselves, then I may say things in conflict to them, such as, "How do you think that made him or her feel?" I'm trying to teach my child that what is good or bad or right or wrong based on putting the other person's perspective into the conversation. So I'm trying to regulate messages by emphasizing how another person is affected by the behavior of my child. What this leads to, that Burleson has found, is that it enhances children's ability to be empathetic and to perspective take. Empathetic, or empathy, being the ability to empathize with someone on a human level. I know what you're going through because I went through something similar. Perspective taking is the idea of being able to view something through the eyes of someone else, trying to walk in their shoes, or see how they might view something based on their own upbringing or experiences. So this builds complex and sophisticated mental representations of the child when it comes to how they view themselves, how they view others, and their relationships. So this is similar to attachment. Another parenting approach, unfortunately, that exists is also called position-centered, and it's not all unfortunate. This is where parents use regulating and comforting messages that emphasize rules and norms that apply regardless of how persons are affected by the behavior of others. What this means is that instead of saying, "You shouldn't do that because how do you think that makes them feel?" Instead, you're saying, "You shouldn't do that because that breaks a rule in our family." For example, someone with a position-centered parenting approach might say, "This is not the way you behave in front of company." Through this approach, you are focusing on the social norms and conventions that govern a particular situation and govern what you think is appropriate and normal in a given situation. This does help socialize your child, and it does help them learn. So it can lead children to focus on context and norms, and therefore learn based on their environment, what is acceptable and not, and therefore how to communicate. But the unfortunate part to position-centered parenting approaches is that this does not simply or necessarily help them build perspective taking or take another person's feelings into consideration. And that is really important in mitigating and dealing with conflict. So this parenting approach leads to less complex understanding of oneself in relation to others. There's also the notion of spillover in parent-child relationships. What this means is that how a parent communicates in various relationships can affect their other various relationships. For example, there is considerable research that says that two-parent conflict, so feuding parents or feuding spouses, has potential to actually spill over and affect multiple relationships within the family system. For example, two feuding parents can affect the parent-child relationship. If I am constantly arguing with my spouse, I might take for granted some of our shared resources, such as our children. So I might use more combative or hostile communication and conflict with a child of mine because I'm experiencing that interparental conflict. It also can affect sibling relationships. There's this notion that we learn from our parents how we deal with conflict. So if we witness our parents experiencing negative conflict cycles, or engaging in negative reciprocity like we've talked about previously, we might emulate that behavior in our sibling relationships as well. It can also affect our peer relationships. Again, we learn from our parents. We're socialized based off of that experience of learning from how our parents act. So we might bring in conflict approaches that we witness and observe that our parents are using with each other into our other relationships. Not just siblings, but with our peers, our friends, and our classmates. What this really identifies is that conflict styles are often learned through observation of others, including our parents. There has been considerable research that concludes our conflict style could be based on the conflict style of our parents or the conflict style they display with their spouse and we witness. So it's important really to think about this idea of spillover effect in family systems. So again, what this points out is that families often function as systems, something we pointed out early on in this course. So this points out that systems theory perspective. If we want to point out one flaw or part in the system, we have to look at how the entire system is communicating or functioning. Now, something that your readings from this module point out is that there are multiple levels of influence on a family system, and therefore on family conflict. For example, the individual cognitions or desires of an individual family member can influence how they communicate with others. So an individual's attributions or an individual's experience with anxiety or uncertainty can actually alter how they communicate with a parent or sibling. We also know that the dyadic communication that is interplayed between partners can affect how other members of the family communicate as well. Now we saw on the other slide that if two parents are feuding, that can be dyadic communication between that dyad, but it can also spill over and affect other dyads within the family, such as siblings or a parent-child relationship. We also know that we need to look at whole family functioning. I personally do a lot of research on non-traditional family types, specifically restructured families such as step or blended families. When it comes to these families talking about how they identify themselves as a family and what family really means to them, it is how the whole family engages in these narratives that affects how the individuals and the dyads communicate with one another. So how does your family talk about family to those outside the family? What is your story of origin of how your family came to be? How we talk about that as a whole family and to those outside our family affects how we communicate within the system. We also know that there is considerable outside influences on family systems. For example, the culture and the community or the environment in which a family is embedded can alter the communication practices in conflict within that system. If you think about what defines a family, this definition, or really the multiple definitions, have changed and evolved over the years. It used to be that you had to be a heterosexual couple with their biological children. Now we define family in many different ways, including biological ties, adopted ties, marital ties, in-law ties, step families, blended families, single house or single parenting families, and so on. And as this definition is changing, so too is how people are viewing family and what they identify to be considered a family. So even laws are changing, such as legalizing same-sex marriage. And that is an outside influence on how families communicate about themselves, or again, how they talk about the story of origin of their families. Now let's talk a little bit about sibling relationships. Sibling relationships are very unique in that they are usually the longest relationships of our lives. We usually don't meet a romantic spouse until later on in life. We oftentimes outlive our parents. But our siblings usually are relative in our age and tend to be the ones that live with us the longest when it comes to someone that we have aged with over time and together. So sibling relationships are really important. They also serve many functions. Siblings can serve as a peer, as confidants, or someone we vent to or confide in, especially venting or confiding in them about other members of the family system. They can be our supporters, but they can also be our rivals or someone who interferes with resource control that we'll talk about in a second. So much like parent-child communication, sibling relationships evolve over time. You might bicker with a particular sibling a lot because you lived with one another during adolescence, but that may alter once you move away and have geographic distance between you. So always remember that these relationships are constantly in flux and they evolve over time. There's a lot of influences on conflict between siblings, and this has been documented very well across disciplines and research, and your readings point to this in this module. For example, parental favoritism. Whether this is actual or perceived favoritism can influence sibling conflict. If we feel our sibling is being favored by our parents over us, then that can lead to conflict. Birth order. A lot of early research on family systems argues that younger siblings acted a particular way, older siblings acted a particular way, and middle siblings acted in a unique way because they were in the middle. However, researchers have tried to stray away from the distinguishing differences in birth order and instead focus on how resource control is altered when we add new people to the family. If you're an only child, you tend to have more resources. You probably had your own room, you probably had most of your parents' attention and affection. But when another sibling comes along, either through adoption, remarriage, or birth, then you are now vying for those resources more because the sibling also needs similar resources as well. They also need space. They also need to communicate and have attention and affection from your parents. So as we add to the family, our sibling resources become more strained, and we have to vie for those resources, possibly more competitively. We also know that gender is an influence on sibling relationships. Female dyads tend to bond more over shared experiences and open communication. So siblings that are sisters tend to bond more and have more emotional disclosure than male siblings or brothers. And much like we talked about in the early part of this lecture, attachment can influence a lot of relationships. As your readings point to in this module, siblings are also affected by attachment style. If you do not open up or express to other people, that might also include your siblings. That might alter how you talk about relationships, even within your own family system with your siblings. Now, there's been considerable research, again, that you will read about this week that talks about the influence on individual personalities. Specifically, how is our sibling communication influenced by the different ways we communicate? Or rather, how are our individual personalities influenced by the ways we communicate with the sibling? Now, Adler is a scholar that talks about how external social influences develop our personalities. He was particularly interested in how families are essential in creating one's own sense of self and their views on if they are inferior to others. Really, what Adler was arguing for is that egalitarianism, or really just the equal treatment of siblings by our parents, is absolutely vital in making sure that as parents you promote good self-esteem in both children. Or else a child will create these ideals of favoritism, and like we know now, that can spill over into the sibling relationship. So perceived parental favoritism is linked, of course, to sibling conflict because they feel inferior to a particular sibling. So what this means is that families that want to build their children to have good self-esteem equally, this means they need to communicate to them in equal ways that makes parental favoritism not be perceived. Lastly, the sibling influences on individual personalities has also been discussed when it comes to social comparison theory. This is simply a theory that says that we learn and make our own identity based on comparing ourselves to the accomplishments of not only our peers, but specifically to our closest peers, which are our siblings. So a younger sibling may look up to an older sibling and want to achieve similar accomplishments. So I might alter my personality in a way that wants to match what my sibling is doing. So younger siblings likely make these upward comparisons. They might say, I want to be like my big brother, so I'm going to like this sport too. We also know that this can be good or bad. For example, if you feel like your upward comparison is unachievable, and you may think to yourself, I'll never be able to be as smart as my older sister, then that can have negative repercussions on your self-esteem, your views of self, and your views of others. But if parents are cultivating positive upward comparisons, such as asking a younger child, what do you like about your older brother? How do you think you can learn from him to do that too? Then that can be constructive or positive. Lastly, social learning theory helps explain some of the sibling influence on individual personalities. Individuals acquire attitudes, beliefs, and additional behaviors through both reinforcement and observation of others' behaviors. So siblings shape their own relationship in the context of their social exchanges, so how they communicate. So this reciprocity of positive or negative behavior, or seeking confirmation or ostracism from a sibling, can again shape and mold our personality, particularly when it comes to our values and beliefs. So if I observe a behavior that my sibling does, such as, let's say, partying a lot, and I tell my sibling that I don't approve of that, then there's a possibility that my sibling might no longer do that behavior because it was not justified or confirmed or accepted by their peer, in this case being their sibling. But if instead I see my sibling doing a behavior and I actually imitate it myself, then that communicates to my sibling that I confirm or approve of this behavior. So, in essence, we learn how to be social based off of comparing or imitating the behavior of those closest to us. And if you have a sibling, oftentimes that is your sibling. So, siblings are salient models for social learning.